circular reasoning and causal effects. That is going to be the topic of this episode of Chi Life. Okay, so as we get more and more into our Qigong practice, we tend to gain a greater and greater understanding and appreciation of how everything is connected. Now, within our body, everything is connected. I mean, clearly it's all physically connected, it's all part of one body. But also it's connected in, well, other very literal ways in terms of how physical force moves through the body. Movement of one part of the body is affecting other things right through the whole body. Changes in our posture, and change in a posture somewhere will affect right through the rest of the body and have an effect, change things elsewhere. When we have an emotion, it affects one organ, but it then affects the other organs, and it affects stuff, through our posture, and it's all connected. There's connections, and so often working in one area is really useful at changing things and bringing balance to other parts of the body and energy system, of course. Moving beyond this, we then also start to develop a richer understanding of our interaction with the environment and how these are connected, how it affects us. Several times in the last few vlogs, I've mentioned and maybe emphasized the important role our environment has and the effect it has on us. We're really connected to our environment. We're shaped by our environment, and at the same time, we also shape our environment. The weather affects us, all of these things. We also develop an understanding of our connection and interaction with other people, how they affect us and how we also affect them. And as we gain a better and better understanding of how everything's connected and it all affects everything else, there can be a tendency sometimes for some people to allow this to lead them into a circular way of thinking, where they think, well, if I do this, it does this, but then this does this, and it's kind of like everything is just, the area I'll focus on for this is particularly in terms of interpersonal interactions, but it applies to all of this as well, where you can get into this circular way of thinking, where people say, well, another person, or, I did this because another person did this, and that sort of brought out this response in me. And why did they behave in that way? Well, maybe they behaved in that way because of what I was doing, which brought out that response in them. Now, this is just two people, interaction between them. And it's kind of like, well, what? So you have no free will? So you're just trapped into having the same type of interaction with this person? Because what they did made me respond in a certain way, and what I did made them act in a certain way. Okay, but people literally do get into this like circular, yeah, but it was because of this, and that was like they've got no choice in the matter. This then actually extends out. I mean, two people, it's at its most ridiculous with two people, but you can expand out into much larger networks. Well, this happened because of this, and it was because of this, and well, and you can see how I've described it already. It's valuable to recognize that, yes, the way a certain person behaves will draw out other type of behavior from someone else. And so partly our own behavior might be being drawn out by someone else behaves, or also the behavior of someone else towards us might be being drawn out by things that are going on with us. And these things can be very subtle. They can be obvious behaviors, things we say, our posture, our body language, things like that. That can be it too. But it can be much, much more subtle down to what's going on in our energy that can sort of elicit or draw out a certain type of behavior from other people. It's helpful to recognize this. But I've seen it, many times where this goes too far into thinking it's kind of like, well, this is all, yeah, it's just a circular thing where it's just like, well, this is just because of that. And it becomes a way to, I think, often avoid responsibility for your own actions and avoid, sometimes to avoid putting responsibility onto other people for their actions and choices as well. Yeah. And sometimes people think of that as kind of like being like a compassionate way of thinking. It's like, oh, they only did this because of all these other things that affected them, their environment and what someone else did and so on. That's why they did this, and they've kind of, therefore it's not their fault. but then also the flip side, and then my behavior is not my fault because of what someone did to elicit it. That's a misunderstanding of how everything's connected. Certainly in my opinion. Other people might have a different opinion. Everyone's free to have their own opinion, of course. If you have a different opinion, put it below. Be curious to hear it. But yeah, in my opinion, that's a misunderstanding of this principle of connection and how everything affects each other. Because everything's connected and affects each other does not take away our personal effectiveness and choice. It influences it. We can recognize like, hey, I was influenced in this way to behave in a certain way or so on. Or similarly, someone else was influenced in this way to do whatever they did, but I've still got my own choice. With all of the things that might lead me or push me towards something, I've still got my own choice. I am still in charge of my life and steering my own direction, choosing my own actions. And yes, the circumstances of life, behavior of other people, environment and so on might steer me strongly in a certain direction. It might be like a strong current flowing in a certain direction that takes me that way. I can still choose to swim across that current or against that current. Might not be easy, but I still have choices. And yeah, if that current's really strong, it's really understandable and, you know, desirable probably even to cut people, like people in certain situations, to cut them more slack, give them more allowance. Like, yeah, they had some pretty big influences them, but it doesn't change the fact that we still have our own power. You know, to think that everything is the result of things outside of us, it takes away our own personal sovereignty and power. We do have our power. That does operate within some constraints in terms of like, oh, well, what was it practical for us to be able to do? Absolutely. But our choices are still our own and they make a difference. And that's a powerful thing to remember in terms of how everything's connected. Yeah, lots of things are all going together to create the situation for us personally in our lives, the situation for people around us, the situation in the world as a whole. But what each of us does matters. It makes a difference. It can make a change in our lives. It can make a change in other people's lives. It can make a change to the whole world to some extent. And particularly when each of us takes responsibility for our own actions, our own choices, our own directions, our own decisions, now we start to have real power. As we start to each individually make good choices, we're a powerful force for good. And this is where it's helpful to understand, yes, the interrelatedness of things, but that we still do have a causal power. Sometimes things do have a point of origin, where it started. Yeah, not just like, oh, it came from this and this and this and that. No, at some point, someone made a choice and that put things into action. That started to create a new change, a new direction, and so on. And we can do this in our own lives. All right. Hopefully that's an interesting one. Might give someone a little bit of insight, a little bit of inspiration to recognize the power of our connection to things, to recognize how much it influences us, but also that it's a network effect. It's not like it doesn't predetermine our fate, our actions, what we do. Back to interpersonal connections and interactions a lot. What typically happens here, because sometimes, or typically, what sometimes happens is if someone has a very clear, specific, because again, back to the one-on-one sort of interactions, sometimes someone will have a pattern of really, and it's generally unconscious, wanting to create a certain type of interaction with other people. And they want someone to, again, unconsciously, they want someone to criticize them. They want someone to argue with them. They want someone to be domineering, whatever it might be. They want someone to be overly sympathetic to them. All sorts of things that they might have a deep pattern, generally unconscious, of bringing into their life. And what will often happen is other people, but because of the way this person behaves, they interact them with all sorts of ways that shape the interaction towards receiving this sort of response from them. And for the other person interacting with this person with a strong unconscious habit pattern, it can be very easy to fall into like just treating them away the way they're eliciting, the way they're drawing out, to just like they just bring this out. But if you maintain your own power, your own decisions, you can stay strong against that and just decide, no, I'm not going to act in that way. Yeah, they're acting in a way that seems entirely reasonable, to get angry at them, or whatever it is, or to be domineering, or to be overly like they're really drawing. I have my power. I can choose to swim against that current or away from it, and not to be that way. And sometimes that can be a really powerful thing, and actually starting to create change in this person who has this deep unconscious pattern of eliciting this type of behavior. It can actually start to change things for them. They realize that, this person's not responding the way I keep unconsciously trying to get this kind of response. They're not doing it. It can start to create change. Other times it won't create the change. But what will happen is either the person with the deep unconscious pattern will break off the interaction with the person who's not given the response they want and find someone else to interact with to draw that kind of response out. Or the person who's not giving that response, they might find it too tiring, too draining to constantly swimming against this current to maintain their behavior when the person is doing stuff to elicit a different behavior, and they will exit that situation, that interaction, to interact with people who are going to just allow them to act the way that they would like to, more comfortably, more freely. So again, there's choices there. There's choices about how we act, and there's also choices about who we interact with and so on. But the power is ours. All right, hopefully that's useful in some way. I look forward to seeing you on another vlog soon.